Welcome to the conversation here at the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. I'm Mark Koplik, Assistant Director. We're excited to be talking with Dr. Hector Garcia, author of Sex, Power, and Partisanship: How Evolutionary Science Makes Sense of Our Political Divide. It's an eye-opening book that will change the way you see your conservative uncle and your liberal aunt. Chimpanzees, the bones and relics of Stone Age societies, DNA evidence, and pre-modern religious texts tell us a great deal about the origins of modern-day political behaviors. An evolutionary psychologist, Hector Garcia, explains the deep roots of our attitudes toward leadership, the social safety net, taxation, war, peace, religion, race, immigration, social equality, marriage, and adultery. Not just illuminating, it's also a fun read and a surefire conversation starter for your next COVID-safe outdoor social gathering. You can purchase Sex, Power, and Partisanship via a link to an independent bookseller here on this screen. It's also available as an audiobook. Dr. Garcia is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio. He's a nationally recognized expert on helping combat veterans recover from the traumas of war. His TED Talk on innovative ways to address post-traumatic stress disorder has received more than 1 million views. His previous book is Alpha God: The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression, a powerfully argued and original thesis that our conceptions of God in monotheism derive from our inborn deference to the alpha male, the big man or big chimp. Hector, thanks so much for joining us.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
So politics is really about sex. Conservative politics is a male reproductive strategy and liberal politics is a female reproductive strategy. Is that correct?
That's the argument that I make in the book. Yes, it's, bottom line, there's a lot of surface level things happening that are befuddling, that are confusing, that, charge the adrenaline. But really, it's, a lot of our political perspectives, a lot of our political psychology is very ancient. And in many respects, that's why our politics can be so volatile at times.
So gender essentialism may raise a lot of red flags with many of our viewers. Men aren't all the same, and neither are women. Can you talk a little bit more about these reproductive strategies, about conservative politics, liberal politics?
So yes, absolutely. Not all men are the same. Not all women are the same. However, there are male typical reproductive strategies, and there are female typical reproductive strategies that we see enacted and in our politics, in our political preferences. And there's a lot of overlap, in politics. Our politics are such a confluence of forces shaping our political perspectives: religion, geography, history, personality, facets of our personality. So tackling something as huge as our political orientations, as I attempt to in the book, it's hard, and there are many qualifications. But in general, the observation has been made that Republicans are the daddy party and Democrats are the mommy party. I think Chris Matthews once made that argument, which, as it turns out, there's a lot more validity to that observation than one might think. So a lot of our reproductive strategies, a lot of our strategies of survival are embedded in our political psychology. And I think it's important to explain it in that direction because, we've had all of our instincts for millions of years before we had anything resembling modern politics. So our political structures get built on top of these earlier instincts.
So can you unpack that a little bit? How is conservative politics a male reproductive strategy?
So maybe even going further back than that, one of the things that we notice is that our political orientations fall on a natural curve, right? There's some people who endorse highly conservative political ideals, some people who the opposite, the highly liberal political ideals, and most of us are somewhere in between. As it turns out, there are a lot of different factors that predict where we fall on that natural curve. One of them is fear of germs. So perhaps we can start, but it's such a broad topic, perhaps we can start by unpacking that, So in our evolutionary past, germs were a real threat, right? And they are today, obviously, in the time of Corona, but this is before we had anything resembling, we didn't have vaccines, we didn't have antibiotics, we weren't aware of this invisible world around us in microcosm that makes us sick. So fearing germs and fearing infection and fearing outsiders was very useful in our evolutionary past because the biggest vectors of disease were outside human beings. Outsiders brought in diseases that we didn't have immunity for, and so could potentially wipe out an entire tribe. So as it turns out, one prediction is that when you look at our fear of germs, which also falls on a natural curve, that predicts where one falls on the natural curve of political orientation, almost to a T. Like the more politically conservative you are, the more you fear germs. The less politically conservative you are, the more liberal you are, the opposite. The same goes with xenophobia. So the more fearful of outsiders you are in general, the more likely you are to be politically conservative, and vice versa for political liberalism. So that's one aspect of our ancient psychology that gets expressed in our current day political orientations. And you can see that in terms of policy preferences, so people on the right are more hawkish in their foreign policy, more supportive of stricter border legislation, regulating our borders, that kind of thing, and vice versa.
So like politics, war is really about sex. Can you explain that?
Well, I do make the argument that way back, like most mammals, male mammals, they will compete for mates, right? And often that competition is violent, and I think it's something that you see in across mammals, across all the great apes, and even human beings. So, take chimpanzees, for example. What chimpanzees do, and it's really stunning if you ever get to watch some of this footage, is that they will form these all male war parties. And normally boisterous, loud, hooting, hollering primates, they go totally silent. And it's almost like they know what's happening. So they all go silent, and they start off in this single file special gate reserved for combat, and they patrol the edges of their territory. If they spot a lone male or a smaller party, they attack, right? And what happens over time when these raids are conducted pretty consistently in their superior numbers, one side eliminates all the males from the other side. And so what happens is they move into that territory. There are rewards for that, just like there are rewards for engaging in warfare among humans. Territory, all that lies within territory, fruit trees, colobus monkeys, all their prey animals, but also the resident females of the rival troop. Those get absorbed into the troop, increasing mating opportunities for those conducting war. So chimpanzees have a reproductive incentive to engage in war. Well, across the history of our species, we've engaged in similar behaviors, as chilling as that is. I mean, you look at hunter-gatherers, it's not uncommon to conduct raids on the neighbors, skewer all the men with arrows, and capture women for your wives, for your tribe. That's in the Bible. It's like biblical warfare was all about that kind of thing. Mass rape, basically. the incidence of wartime rape is incredibly high. And, you know, even though we don't always go to war with that in mind, you know, and that people aren't consciously thinking, hey, I'm going to go to war so I can, you know, I can gain females. I mean, and many men would never, ever rape in war. But it's incredibly common, and some groups actually make war with intentionally, with that goal in mind, like Boko Haram, for example, and ISIS. So there is a ancient reproductive incentive for making war that seems to mirror what's been happening throughout the history of our species and earlier primates.
So how is liberalism a female reproductive strategy?
You know, and I think that may be a slight oversimplification, right? Because there are a lot of men who are liberal, but you know, it's interesting when you look at what predicts liberalism. You know, it's the tamping down of these male strategies to dominate, to assume a higher position on the hierarchy. You know, so it's interesting when you look at in the research lab, when you look at men with higher levels of just endogenous testosterone, naturally occurring testosterone, they're less likely to share resources in laboratory games. They're more likely to keep resources. They're more likely to want a dominance position over the other people around them. And the less testosterone you have, the less you're likely to take that strategy in laboratory games. And that there's a reproductive incentive for that, right? To dominate. So we see those differences expressed in policy preferences. I mean, it's no secret that you know, liberal politics are marked more by a preference for equalizing strategies, right? Equal pay for women, affirmative action, things like that, welfare. So policies that equal the playing field, right? So there, all these modern day policy preferences, you know, often can be traced back to some very basic issues of survival and reproduction.
Can a chest thumping alpha male conservative be converted to liberalism?
I think, you know, we are incredibly adaptable as a species. And when you look at how much genes, like twin studies look at how much genes influence political decisions, and probably about 40 to 50% of the variance in our political behaviors. You know, that leaves, you know, 60 to 50% up to learning, up to experience. You know, we're not genetic automatons, you know, and that's important to understand. You know, when we study these evolutionary you know, tendencies, it doesn't mean that you know, we're doomed to behave in a way that our genes command us to, one way or another. There's learning, there's preference, there's becoming aware of our impulses and making more informed choices. Absolutely. But there are certain tendencies, right? There are certain tendencies based on, you know, based on our genetics.
You make an analogy to our unhealthy cravings for cookies and ice cream. Can you talk about that? How these are, you know, mismatched, kind of outdated impulses that we carry around with us, but that we're not necessarily slaves to.
All right. So you know, I pose the question. I think it's an important question that you know, are some of our impulses, or evolutionary impulses, mismatched diseases, or just evolutionary mismatches? And so that what that means is when we have a certain evolutionary arrived at impulse or predisposition that doesn't tend to match our current environment. And an often cited example of this is craving for high fat high sugar foods, right? In our evolutionary past, when starvation was a lot more common, and caches of fat or sugar were pretty rare, it benefited us to really crave these foods, and when we came across a cache, gorge ourselves on them because they're high calorie foods. And when you're living hand to mouth, that's a really important, that helps us to conserve energy through periods of scarcity, or to store energy, I should say. Well, how many hundreds of thousands of years where we're living kind of hand to mouth, and then today we have access to these foods at will. We can go to a fast food place and get how many grams of sugar and fat in easily in a big lump, and we can do that every day if we want to. So what has happened with that mismatch between our evolutionary arrived at preferences and the modern day the modern environments that we've forged for ourselves, is we get mismatched diseases like type 2 diabetes, like obesity, heart disease, things like that, which are more likely to kill us than any other cause of death worldwide. So, I sometimes like to pose the question for all of our evolutionary impulses, like we need to ask ourselves how much do these impulses serve us, and do so without flinching, do so even though there may be some deeply embedded, tribalistic loyalties behind some of our evolutionary impulses. Because, for example, fearing outsiders, that may have benefited us tremendously when outsiders carried infectious diseases that we had no immunity for. It may have benefited tremendously when the outside tribe could raid us at will and slaughter all the men in our village and take our women for their wives. So a lot has changed. I mean, Steven Pinker, in his book Better Angels of Our Nature, has really done a fantastic job of describing how we have gotten more civil towards one another since our days as hunter-gatherers, and even since the past 200 years, incredibly so. So I asked the question, I mean, how much does that psychology benefit us to be, excessively wary of outsiders? Does that cause societal problems in pluralistic societies like the ones that we're living in now, where there's people of different ethnicities, of different religions, of different backgrounds that we may see as outsiders? We saw what happened after the 2016 election. There were fractures along race lines, along political lines. We tend to fracture and form tribes within nations that fight each other in the streets based on that psychology of the other, right? So yeah, I think asking ourselves, okay, which one of these serves us, and what of these evolutionary impulses have we outlived in the modern day? I think that's an important question.
You talked specifically about the fear of the outgroup male, the male individual who, quote unquote, isn't one of us. That fear seems to be the root of so much evil in our society: racism and profiling and police abuse. Are there practical ways that we can address that exaggerated fear?
Fear of outsider males. Well, I hope so. I think that insight is the first step. I think we need to teach critical thinking skills in public schools. I think it needs to be a mandatory part of public education. I think one of the things I love about the evolutionary sciences is that it gives us insight into impulses that we would otherwise just enact without consideration, right? Just fluidly. Most of our psychology operates underneath the radar of our conscious awareness, of all kinds of psychology, clinical psychology, but our evolutionary psychology certainly. we're not aware, we're not aware of our drives a lot of, sometimes we are, but a lot of times we just enact our basest impulses and don't really understand where it comes from. So I do see tremendous value in, having the evolutionary sciences, giving them a greater voice in public education, so that we can reflect on these impulses. We can reflect on how they cause impasses within our nation's borders. Because if not, we're just not, we're not as free.
We know that many conservatives, evangelicals particularly, I guess, are not big fans of the theory of evolution, but progressives also have a big beef with the idea that biology is destiny. Do you find that you encounter opposition to evolutionary psychology across the political and cultural spectrum?
I would say yes, wouldn't you? I'm sure you've heard these protestations before. Absolutely. And the interesting part is that those problems with Evo Psych tend to be stereotyped depending on what your political orientation is, right? And we call this the naturalistic or the moralistic fallacies. So, and again, just because we may have an impulse for something doesn't mean it's inevitable. We can make different choices. More so when we're aware of the impulse itself, right? And our impulses aren't necessarily good or moral, But for example, people on the left, or the fallacy expressed on the left is more likely to sound like, well, gender discrimination is bad, so therefore the sexes must be identical. Otherwise, they must be. Or war is undesirable, so we can't possibly have a predisposition or an instinct for it. And on the other end, it tends to be more the other way. So war is natural. So I mean, it's gross oversimplification, obviously, but war is natural, so it must be okay. Women and men are different, so gender discrimination must be, it's therefore more acceptable. It's just the natural order of things. And both of those are mistaken ways of looking at our evolved psychology.
I wanted to mention again that this is a very enjoyable book to read. Your arguments are always very clear, and your examples from human prehistory are extremely vivid. Your interpretations of biblical texts are, for want of a better word, revelations. And your book isn't burdened by academic jargon. How did you come to choose your authorial voice?
That's a good question. I don't know. How do we choose that? Reading people we like and thinking, wow, I really, I think a writing style just gets informed by all the wonderful authors you read, and that their voice resonates with you. Plus, I just don't think, I write science books, and I cite so much research. It doesn't have to be boring. It doesn't have, you don't have to use arcane language. That's more about ego, right? It doesn't, you don't have to, I want it accessible to the lay public. It should be fun. It should be interesting. It should be, it should be something that not just the academic elite can read and understand. That's kind of my whole mission in book writing, as it were.
Does your role as a clinical psychologist talking with rank and file soldiers have anything to do with the clarity and accessibility of your work?
Maybe. It certainly gives me insight, because I specialize in combat related PTSD, and it certainly gives me insight into the psychology of warfare. And I write a lot about male psychology and coalition building and things of that nature. But yeah, when you're doing clinical work, you you don't want to use highly clinical language. You want to, the goal is understanding, that's the goal, engagement. So, yeah.
You mentioned being inspired by other authors. Are there folks that are real touchstones for you? Books that are real touchstones?
Oh gosh, yeah, all of these right here, and all the future ones I haven't read yet. Sure, many, many, many. I really like Will and Ariel Durant. Like the way they write history is just so. I mean, how many decades later? It's just so crisp. But many authors, absolutely, yeah.
When people join groups, you point this out in your book, they often suspend their ability to think critically. And they'll sometimes accept preposterous ideas, and they become more capable of doing terrible things that they would never do as individuals. Why is that so?
That is such an important question, and I'm honestly, I'm contemplating another book just really answering this very topic, because the psychology of groups is irrational. We've known that for a long time. I mean, groupthink takes over and people say and do things they otherwise wouldn't do. A lot of it, I think, comes from a need to show in-group loyalty, so being ejected by the group in our past would have been a death sentence. If you're imagine, I often kind of play out the thought experiment and talks like this, like, imagine if we took you just based on what you're wearing, or even not wearing anything, and dropped you off in the middle of the Serengeti. How long would you survive? An hour? We need each other, and even more so in our past, where we lived hand to mouth, and where there were dangers all around us. Being abandoned by the tribe is, not only was it dangerous in our evolutionary past, but that danger has produced a really intense, ancient, sometimes subliminal fear. We're terrified of that. So we do whatever we can to belong to the group. And sometimes it is showing your commitment to the group, whether it's what have been called badges, like dressing a certain way, tribalistic scarring, wearing a MAGA hat or something like that, or the bumper stickers on your car, or behaviors that you do. But sometimes that show of loyalty is an idea. And the problem is sometimes the ideas are just terrible ideas, or they're faulty. So, but if the idea has become the marker of group loyalty, you're not going to question it. If you question those ideals, what's going to happen? You're going to get ejected. And even though being ejected from a social group today, who cares? You go to the grocery store, you still get your groceries. You're not going to get savaged by a lion on your way home from the grocery store, But all of these accoutrements around us are an eye blink of time in our history. So we still have these ancient fears, and there's research showing this. The research is fascinating, I think, showing how these fears are still there.
We recently had conservative pundit George Will in our series, and he quit his tribe. He quit the Republican Party to protest the rise of Trump. And he advises people not to join groups, not to be joiners, and to retain their autonomy as individuals. And that was his advice for young people. What do you think about that?
Sound advice. Absolutely, sound advice. Question the group. Thoughtfully question the group, because if so much of your own free thought can so easily get swallowed, a lot of times outside of your awareness. people sometimes don't even understand that, why they really, I think there's a lot of self-deception, and people self-deceive in order to belong to the group, and they're not aware of it. Sometimes people are. Sometimes people say, yeah, I just voice this view or adhere to this view so I wouldn't get ejected from the tribe. I hear that a lot when people have left their religion. Like, oh, I believe for so long. I pretended I believe for so long because I would have committed social suicide if I admitted that I didn't believe. And the same can hold true for political beliefs. But sometimes people aren't aware of that. Sometimes people aren't aware of that, the self-deception that takes place in order to belong. And I think we need to be. I mean, belonging to a group, I mean, we that is our biggest adaptation. I mean, we would be nothing without one another. Daniel Dennett once made the point that, hey, in one sense, we are joined by this one big, singular, massive brain, the computing power of people displaced in time and space and other thinkers. And we benefit from that. That is who we are. We are, that's who we are. So sometimes, the psychology of groups, it can help us. I mean, what would we do without each other? But sometimes it can be very toxic, and it can, and that psychology can result in us literally fighting ourselves in the streets, as we saw during the Trump administration. And that's why we have to pay attention to this stuff, in my opinion.
If there were a fire in your house, you would save your child first, then your cousin, then a stranger, and your goldfish last, because you and your goldfish share the fewest genes. I mean, you do share genes with your goldfish, but it's far fewer. But a lot of studies show that people will save their beloved pets before helping a stranger. So how flexible are these genetic imperatives?
We have to think probabilistically. They're flexible. You're talking about a concept known as kin altruism, where we're more likely to engage in altruistic acts that maybe put ourselves at risk in order to help somebody else. Our willingness to do so is very highly correlated to the amount of genes we share in common with the person who we're rescuing from the fire, as it were. But there are we have the ability to choose. There is some flexibility, and that's a good message. I think that's a good message for the Evo sciences, because I think people, again, they fear that, hey, if I admit that my genes or my biology have some influence over my choices in mates, my choices in friendships, my political choices, does that mean I'm giving up freedom? Am I giving up a sense of personal agency? But I think it's frankly, it's quite the opposite. I mean, the more we know, the more we have conscious awareness of this, the more, conscious choices we can make instead of just acting on impulse.
Do we need more women in positions of power to ensure our survival as a species?
Maybe. I mean, I think there's maybe a clear empirical question is, do we have more stable societies when there are more women in positions of power? Which I to some extent, I think that could translate into things like war or other kinds of destructive human behavior sets. But to that question, the empirical evidence is pretty clear. The more nations where there are more women in positions of political authority, government changes. The way we govern ourselves changes. We spend less on the military. We go to war less. We spend more on things that maybe reflect women's evolutionary impulses to provision children, like, you know, education, spending on education increases, on healthcare increases when more women are in positions of power. And when more men are in positions of power, there's more money spent on the military. So, and you know, on a very deep level, men have an incentive to make war. We've always had, you know, to raid the rival tribe and get their goods, you know, and take their territory. We've been engaging in this for our whole history. So I've made the argument that, well, you know, when you have more women in positions of power, their evolutionary imperatives get expressed, you know, through policy. So maybe so.
Can you tell us about your education as a writer?
Like, what do you mean? Like, did I?
Well, you know, when you were young, were there books, were there teachers that inspired you? I mean, who taught you most? Who was your best advisor? Who were your best teachers as a writer?
Not growing up, I was self-taught. I come from a little border town, El Paso. I was a high school dropout. I was bored as hell with my schooling growing up. So didn't come from my teachers. It came from reading books in Evo Psych, reading, oh my gosh, David Buss, Steven Pinker, Daniel Dennett. I just eat that stuff up growing, you know. And you know, everybody else that I've read kind of influences my style, but it was really just reading, just reading books and studying how people express themselves.
People want to know, how did you become, I mean, it was reading, as you say, but how did you find your way back into education as a high school dropout? I was not aware of that.
Oh boy, there's a memoir in there somewhere. The short version is I got tired of doing things that didn't interest me, and I came back to school at 23 and realized, oh my gosh, I love this. I mean, when I was a little kid, I skipped a grade because on the border, they don't know what to do with kids who were smart. So you skip a grade and then you're younger than everybody else. It's a terrible idea. I think now things have changed. That was a long time ago. But no, I came back to undergrad at maybe 23, 24, and I was just like, wow, I love this, and just followed that passion ever since.
The book is Sex, Power, and Partisanship: How Evolutionary Science Makes Sense of Our Political Divide. It's available for purchase from an indie bookstore via a link on this screen. Thank you so much, Hector Garcia.
My pleasure.
Let me remind you that this and all of our author interviews are posted on the Writers Institute's YouTube channel, and you can find them at the conversation on our website, nyswritersinstitute.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. To our audience, thanks so much for tuning in. Be well.